Hello. Welcome to Healing Through Acknowledgment, the Role of Restorative Justice in 20th Century Genocide Recovery by Mrs. Julia R. Sorvelis. I am a graduate student in the Department of Criminal Justice at Bridgewater State University, and I originally presented this at the American Society of Criminology on November 12, 2025. In this presentation, we're going to be talking about some very serious graphic topics. So if you are uncomfortable at any point, please take care of yourself and go walk outside, enjoy something, do something that won't make you think about genocide, because this is a genocide. This is a genocide presentation. If you are interested in reading my paper, you can scan the QR code that you see on your screen, or you can look in the description below. It is found in the Graduate Review, Volume 10 from Bridgewater State University, and my email is on the screen, and I would just love to thank Professor Sims and Dr. Huff from the Department of Criminal Justice at Bridgewater State University for their help and support through researching this entire paper. And if it was not for Professor Sims' restorative justice class, I don't know if I would have done this project. I'm lying. I probably definitely would have done this project, but he allowed me to frame it in this way, and I hope you guys enjoy. Before we talk about restorative justice, we have to talk about retributive justice and what it means and where it comes from. So, retributive justice is one of the earliest forms of justice that we as humans understand and is pretty common today. The concept of it is framed in the Babylonian Code of Hammurabi, where they famously introduced the concept of an eye for an eye, which means that when a human has brought harm to someone, that it is the victim or the victim's family who would seek retribution or vengeance against the offender or the offender's family, rather than the government to intervene on their behalf to delve out justice. So while retributive justice focuses on perpetrating violence against each other, restorative justice is the exact opposite. Restorative justice attempts to bring offenders, victims, and communities together in order to address perpetrated harms and to offer reconciliation for everyone that is involved. The goal of restorative justice is that harm is acknowledged, so a harm can be addressed, and once a harm is addressed, it can ultimately lead to people healing and moving on with their lives. Amends can be offered, and it can only be made if there's a proper acknowledgement of the harm that has been committed by the perpetrator. Forgiveness, although potentially transformative, is not a requirement of restorative justice. So now you understand the different types of justice. Now we have to talk about how they apply to genocide. And specifically, that is what I tried to do in this paper. In this paper, I examine how survivors of different 20th century genocides applied restorative principles naturalistically in order to advance their own healing. The governments at issue would attempt to memorialize and preserve sites of destruction as an attempt to acknowledge the harm that they perpetuated and that these things have actually happened. But it is ultimately left to the individual survivors to heal themselves and to find ways to support themselves and fellow survivors, and to seek accountability from governments for the wrongdoings that have been perpetuated onto them. This paper covers 3 instances of genocide that occurred during the 20th century, and I'm going to show you evidence of naturalistic healing that occurred amongst survivors. Naturalistic healing is the process of finding a way to restore a sense of peace after harm. So now we understand what naturalistic healing means. How are these people healing from being almost annihilated? Most of them end up writing their stories. Many end up seeking answers to questions that they have about what has happened to their families, what has happened to them, how could this have happened, and it's just a lot. There's a lot of answers to questions that people don't have, and they do feel like they need to find the answers to it, which is completely valid. Many of them turn to advocacy and education to prevent future genocides from happening and to make sure that people do not deny that their lived experiences. And many of them stay silent, either for their internal peace or because they're afraid that they'll be targeted again. Now we're going to talk about which genocides did I actually study. The case studies that I used for this project were the Holocaust, the Cambodian Genocide, and the Rwandan Genocide. Now, the reason that I chose to talk about these three cases of genocide is because of the restorative justice timeline. There is no formal restorative justice framework that exists during the time of the Holocaust. The healing, therefore, is left to an individual level after World War II. A restorative justice framework is being developed during the 1970s, during the same time as the Cambodian Genocide. And finally, in the 1990s, when the Rwandan Genocide occurs, there is an actual utilized restorative justice practice that occurs during criminal prosecutions following the genocide. Bear with me, we're going to talk about individual cases now. The Holocaust occurred during the regime of Adolf Hitler's Third Reich in Nazi Germany, which lasted from 1933 to 1945. 11.5 million people were killed during Hitler's regime. People that were targeted included Jews, gypsies, those that were deemed as being mentally unfit, political prisoners, and other deemed undesirable by the Nazi Party. The genocide was fueled by the rise of fascism, which resulted in adverse economic circumstances in Germany following World War I. The term Holocaust means sacrifice on an altar or death by fire, and it refers to how bodies in the largest concentration camps were disposed of through cremation. This should not discount the people who were killed by the Einsatzgruppen, also known as the Nazi death squads in Eastern Europe. And these people are made up of the same demographics of people of who were sent to concentration camps, as well as civilians during the war. The people have a problem with the number 11.5 million, and people also have a problem with the number 6 million. The reason why people do numbers is because we are finding more and more bodies for leftover from the Einsatzgruppen, and it kind of shows how sick they were and how efficient they were in their disposing of human beings, because we are still finding mass graves to this day, and it's horrible. Frankly, it's just terrible. You thought this slide was going to be about Elie Wiesel, huh? It's alright. We'll get to Eli in a bit. Right now, we're going to talk about Olga Lengel, someone who I don't think gets enough recognition as a Holocaust survivor. Most of the media focuses on male Holocaust survivors. We don't really talk about the woman's perspective of the Holocaust. And if there's a woman who can provide you perspective on the Holocaust, it would be Olga Lengel. Olga Lengel is unique because not only is she a female survivor of the Holocaust, she was a medical professional in Auschwitz during the Holocaust. She is actually forced to act as a nurse in the hospital in Auschwitz and was supervised by Dr. Joseph Mengele, meaning that she had to take care of the people that he was doing horrific experiments on. When we talk about ethics and we talk about evil human experimentation, Joseph Mengele is the person that you think of. She does this after her family is murdered upon arrival. Her husband is not murdered upon arrival. Her husband is killed later in the final death march out of Auschwitz. Throughout her book, she weighs the possibility of being liberated and seeking retribution against those that are in the camp with her. Not the survivors, but the people that perish in the camp, but the Nazis that are in the camp and that are responsible for all of this happening to begin with. She finds meaning through her suffering, and she ends up accepting her role as a survivor of the Holocaust. And while she's in Auschwitz, grappling with the death of her family, she ends up joining a smuggling network. And upon joining the smuggling network, she realizes that she has a reason to live. And the quote is right there. I have two reasons to live. One, to work with the resistance movement and help as long as I could stand upon my feet. Two, to dream and pray for the day to come when I would go free and tell the world that this is what I saw with my own eyes and it must never be allowed to happen again. We're still not talking about Night yet. We are going to talk about Dr. Viktor Frankl and A Man's Search for Meaning. Everyone reads Night in high school, and it gives them the perspective of a young man. This provides you with the perspective of a mental health professional and someone who was trained in suicide prevention. And he is known later for his theories on existentialism and ends up creating logotherapy based off of his experiences as a prisoner in concentration camps. And he writes A Man's Search for Meaning in a very short span period of time, just like Olga does after liberation, as a means for naturalistic healing and to share his own survivor account. When he goes to publish this account, he debates if he should publish it anonymously, but he ultimately decides that it's important for him to put his name on this piece of work, because if he doesn't put his name on it and this isn't traced back to someone, no one's going to believe how terrible this is. And he ultimately decides that his personal safety is less important than having the truth be known, which is pretty admirable. And he's correct. It does give weight to it, and it does provide a sense of this is legit. He needed it to be legit. I give him all the credit in the world for being able to write it. I mean, it's a very wonderful book. It's a hard read, he's talking about people living in this camp. He's talking about groups that he develops. He runs little, basically, he, continues his suicide prevention practice inside of these concentration camps, because that's what gives him hope and gives other people meaning, and just basically grounds people understanding that what they're going through is not normal, and that their physiological reactions to it and their mental health obviously is trash. And he maintains his mental health through helping others maintain their mental health, which is insane. But it's also pretty sane if you think about it. So now we're going to talk about the aftermath of the Holocaust and governments and individuals and how they acknowledged the Holocaust. One of the largest people at play in this is General Dwight D. Eisenhower and his evidence collection of Nazi concentration camps. He orders everything to be documented, including with photographs and film. He knew what he was witnessing was way too extreme for anyone to understand without documentation. He ends up collecting over 3 hours of film, which is titled Nazi Concentration Camps. The footage is shown at the Nuremberg trials, and this footage, accompanied with victim impact statements, were used to prosecute the remaining Nazis at the end of the war. Okay, but what is a victim impact statement? A victim impact statement is pretty self-explanatory. It is a statement made by a victim that discusses the impact that being a victim of a crime has and will continue to have on their life. The Holocaust was acknowledged with the usage of victim impact statements and survivor testimonies at Nuremberg. Many of the Nazis that had been perpetuating all of these awful things had escaped, or they killed themselves, or they had been actually caught and were held accountable during the Nuremberg trials. One of the people that provided testimony and an impact statement was Olga Lengel. She provided testimony about the brutality of the female SS in Auschwitz, such as Irma Gries, and she also testified about the maintenance of a brothel at Auschwitz. She also testified about the various medical experiments that Joseph Mengele conducted at Auschwitz. I'm not going to read what he did or what happened there because I am hoping that this video won't get taken down for it, but the list is right there, and it is disgusting, and it's deplorable, and it's awful, and is why we have the ethics laws that we have about human experimentation. She truly illuminated the darkness that she experienced for others to understand, and in her writing, it reflects that. And she views herself as a survivor, and through her writing and testimony, she was able to restore a sense of herself and a sense of her community, which was decimated. And she played a role in finding a new community and establishing basically an education system on the Holocaust, which is really important because this is one of the worst things that's ever happened in the history of humanity. So, we've talked about how individuals have acknowledged and healed from the Holocaust through their writing and through testifying at Nuremberg. What have governments done to acknowledge that the Holocaust has happened and to prevent further genocide from happening? Well, Poland actually preserved Auschwitz in its entirety. Even during communist rule, they preserved everything. And this includes the belongings of those who are unfortunate enough to be sent to Auschwitz. There's also a mobile Auschwitz exhibit that has over 700 artifacts that travels internationally. Steven Spielberg founded the University of Southern California Shoah Foundation to interview and record the testimonies of Holocaust survivors. The United States acknowledges the Holocaust through the founding and maintaining of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Elie Wiesel worked with the founders of the museum to help properly acknowledge all prisoners and victims of the Holocaust. The goal of the museum is to combat Holocaust denial and to educate individuals on the event and to prevent future genocides from occurring. So now I'm going to talk about Holocaust victim-offender interactions. So when we talk about restorative justice, we usually end up talking about when victims and offenders are brought together to discuss what has happened and to make amends with each other. So when we talk about the victim-offender interactions between Holocaust survivors and the perpetuators of the Holocaust, it's very formal at first. Most are through victim impact statements and testimonies at the Nuremberg trials, and then these people are executed afterwards. It is not until the 21st century that enough individual naturalistic healing could occur for the survivors of the Holocaust and offspring of perpetrators of the Holocaust to begin to interact. Many Nazi leaders were executed at the camps that they ran for their involvement in perpetuation of the genocide. 2 SS commandants met this same fate, and their children lived with the heavy burden knowing that their fathers were regarded and are still regarded to this day as mass murderers and that they were immortalized as monsters in cinema. The commandants that I'm referring to are, of course, Amon Gioff and Rudolf Hess. Amon Gioff was the commandant of the Krakow Palazzo concentration camp in Poland. He was famously portrayed by Ray Fiennes in Steven Spielberg's Schindler's List, and Rudolf Hess was the commandant of Auschwitz and was recently portrayed in The Zone of Interest. Both of these men had young children during the Holocaust that were left without their fathers after the defeat of Nazi Germany and their executions. Their children ended up embarking on a journey of healing by seeking to interact with survivors of their fathers' concentration camps and by visiting the sites following the release of their films. The first victim perpetuator offspring interaction that I'm going to talk about is between Monica Hertwig and Helen Jonas Rosenberg. Her maiden name was Hirsch. She survived the Krakow Palazzo concentration camp. Helen was enslaved as a maid by Monica's dad, Amon Gioff, and this terrifying relationship is depicted in Schindler's List. Monica was a young child during the Holocaust and when her father was executed. Their victim offender offspring interaction occurred in the documentary Inheritance in 2006. Their interaction was notably tense, especially when they visited Krakow Palazzo together. Helen was experiencing symptoms of PTSD. Monica was burdened with the cruelty of her father and was trying to seek some sort of closure through her interaction with Helen. While they did not fully reconcile, there was a mutual acknowledgement and empathy for each other's suffering that they had experienced due to their shared connection to Amon Gioff. The second victim perpetuator offspring interaction we're going to talk about is from the Commandant Shadow, which was released in 2024 after the release of The Zone of Interest in 2023. The interactions are between Anita, her daughter Maya, Hans-Jürgen Haas, and his son Kai. Hans is the son of Rudolf Haas, and Kai is his grandson. Anita is a Holocaust survivor, and Maya is her daughter. Kai and Maya discuss the responsibility that the second generation of survivors and perpetrators of genocide is that they need to try and understand each other and to advocate for genocide prevention in the future. So, what are the results of these interactions between the Holocaust survivors and the children of Nazis? Basically, they understand each other's existence as a consequence of the Holocaust. Hans and Monica were able to understand a greater scope of who their fathers were and the violence that they perpetuated. They also were able to put things that they experienced in their childhood into perspective. These documentaries are examples of naturalistic restorative healing in practice through the illumination and bearing witness. These interactions demonstrate that people seek to understand each other to be able to put their own suffering into context. So, obviously, despite the creation of the United Nations and the definition of genocide and the Lemech Institute and just so many other things that were put into place to prevent war and disease and poverty and genocide from occurring, genocides continue to occur throughout the 20th century to now. And now we're going to talk about what happened in Cambodia in the 1970s. The Cambodian Genocide killed 1.5 to 2 million people during 1975 through 1979. It was a socially engineered experiment by Pol Pot in the Khmer Rouge. Pol Pot was influenced by neighboring communist countries such as China and the Soviet Union, and was able to happen because of the destabilization of neighboring Vietnam. Pol Pot was backed by Mao Zedong and conducted a hostile takeover of Cambodia. The goal was to destroy any reliance on Western civilization. Cambodia had previously been colonized by the French and had evolved into a society that had Western influences and cultural centers, while also having vast jungle wilderness and a considerable peasantry population that lived in the wilderness. The Khmer Rouge forced people living in the cities into the jungle and targeted intellectuals. A lack of ammunition led to many tactics being used to killing people, but most causes of death were blunt force trauma. The bodies of those that were murdered were used as fertilizer in the rice fields. And we will talk about the killing fields and the rice fields in a little bit. Right now, I am going to talk about what immediately happened following the Cambodian genocide so you can understand what I'm talking about further in this presentation. Immediately after the Cambodian genocide, there's kind of a mass exodus that occurs due to the lack of infrastructure and professionals to create an infrastructure following the collapse of the Khmer Rouge and the end of the Vietnam War. There is a disproportionate amount of females to males in the population due to men being killed during the genocide and women being targeted for gender-based violence. After the war, there are only 48 doctors left in Cambodia. Hundreds of thousands of people leave from Cambodia. They go to Thailand, they go to Vietnam, some people go to the United States, and it's really hard for the survivors of the country and the genocide to participate in any reconciliation or truth seeking in Cambodia because they have left from Cambodia. Departed from Cambodia, I should say. One of the best known examples of this is Ouen Long's memoir, First They Killed My Father, which is an account of a child survivor trying to navigate the killing fields and being a child soldier during the Cambodian genocide. Prior to the genocide, she lived in Phnom Penh with her family, and she was forced into the jungle to establish a new life. Her father was not long identified as an intellectual and was murdered. She ended up coming to the United States after the war and experienced alienation from her siblings that had remained in Cambodia, and that could not be reconciled. Despite her going to Cambodia and attempting to reconcile with her siblings, they could not forgive her for actually leaving. Her book is an international bestseller and has been adapted into a film by the same name by Angelina Jolie. So, the rebuilding of Cambodia and the importance of trying to remember what has just occurred happens at the same time. Cambodians work to reestablish their religion and culture, but they also struggle to bring the perpetrators of the genocide to justice. Therefore, they find that they must preserve the memory of the genocide. The easiest way to do this for them is to preserve the sites, like Chuon Ek and Tuol Sleng. Tuol Sleng, like Auschwitz, was a prison and has an exhibit featuring the piling of objects. The difference between the historical preservation of Auschwitz and different places in the Cambodian genocide are that they display human remains with skulls and in stupas. Stupas are containers that hold bone fragments of those that were killed in these areas that are too small to be identified, so they are kept in stupas. Cambodians fear that their memorialized sites have become atrocity tourist destinations, even though their original purpose is to prove that this genocide has happened and to provide closure and potential avenues of investigation for the genocide. Now it's more towards education, but there's a concern that the modern day reason why it is open is so that people can travel internationally and go to these sites, not as a way to reflect on the genocide, but to be like, oh, this terrible thing happened here and it's spooky and I like the vibe of it being spooky. And that's not what the intended purpose of these museums are supposed to be. Despite these sites being targeted for atrocity tourism, they have led to justice. The Documentation Center of Cambodia has located and identified 65% of all the people killed during the genocide. A lot of the documents that were found in places like Tuol Seg led to this. It also has led to people being able to identify those who had been killed and has provided documents proving that perpetrators were indeed perpetrators, and helped bring to light some of the crimes that they committed, the people they killed, and were able to allow the United Nations to prosecute the head warden of Tuol Seg in 2007. I'm going to now talk about one of the most unorthodox victim offender restorative justice interactions that I have ever come across. And it's very, very interesting. Mostly because restorative justice interactions are supposed to occur when people are on an even playing field and you know that you are interacting between someone that you have harmed and understanding that you are also a perpetrator of a crime. And that's how you're supposed to be interacting. Tet Sembaf is a Cambodian filmmaker and genocide survivor, and he ends up befriending Nguyen Chen, the former Khmer Rouge Party secretary, while hiding his background as a Cambodian genocide survivor. He also ends up interviewing people who perpetuated violence during the Killing Fields era. And he ends up facilitating conversations between Nguyen Chen and these perpetrators of violence so that they can have some sort of peace of mind, because they describe their fears and regrets that they have for perpetuating this level of violence. He ends up telling Chen that he actually is a genocide survivor. And during this interaction, Chen expresses his sorrow and deep regret for his actions that led to the death of Tet's family and to the genocide in general. The Rwandan genocide resulted in the death of 800,000 people from April 1994 to July 1994. Colonizers heightened tensions between two ethnic groups in the area, the Tutsis and the Hutu, for years, which, after their liberation in 1961, you would expect to stop. However, Hutu discrimination continued after liberation, which resulted in the Rwandan Civil War in 1990. On April 6, 1994, a plane carrying the president of Rwanda and neighboring Burundi was shot down. The next day, the Hutu extremists broadcast a message through government channels to murder all the Tutsi in Rwanda. Bloodshed occurred, mostly through machetes and other blunt objects were used due to a lack of ammunition, similarly to the Cambodian genocide. Many fled their neighbors by trying to seek sanctuary in Catholic churches. However, the Catholic churches were turned into slaughterhouses. The genocide eventually stopped when the French intervened in June 1994, and all resistance had been quelled by the end of July 1994. The churches were preserved in their entirety and are now used as education centers on the genocide. Catacombs underneath the churches have been established with the dead, and artifacts are kept in these churches as well. We do see the piling of objects like we see in Auschwitz and Tuol Seg. What does come out of the Rwandan genocide is the usage of restorative justice practices, including victim offender interactions in criminal prosecutions following the genocide. The Rwandan Guakua courts are reestablished and use restorative justice practices to acknowledge harm, make amends, and to create solutions for lasting peace within communities following the genocide. 100,000 to 250,000 women were sexually assaulted during the Rwandan genocide. This led to a Rwandan women's rights movement to advocate for themselves and to change the perception of sexual victimization taboos in their society. Mental health support was needed for over 1 million orphans, and Rwandan genocide survivors often do not want to be identified when recorded. Many people came to Rwanda to actually record and make documentaries on the Guakua courts. But what ends up kind of happening is you have people who are going through a court process and living in a post-genocidal society, a very raw, newly post-genocidal society, and they don't want to interact with people with a camera in their face. What is also really sad is that the literacy rate was pretty much demolished in Rwanda following the genocide, and it has also led to less first-hand accounts being published. Though we have a lot of academic papers and on the subject and on the impact of the trauma of this event in this society, there's less writing that is occurring on the genocide than in other genocides like we talked about earlier. We made it to the end. So, in conclusion, the concept that we understand today as restorative justice did not exist until after the Cambodian genocide. However, the need for naturalistic healing is evident throughout all of these case studies. Victim offender interactions are extremely difficult to facilitate because of the brutality of what has occurred, especially in the context of genocide. But it can be beneficial by providing a sense of understanding between two parties. The results are that of acknowledgement and of healing. Interactions between survivors and the perpetuators of survivors can also provide context for the suffering that they have experienced because of the people that they are connected to. Preservation of historical sites related to genocide, memorialize genocidal events, provide education, and respect victims. All preservation efforts are made through the power of individuals who have navigated their own grief and suffering through naturalistic restorative practices. And without them, all of this would be meaningless. Thank you for listening to my presentation, and I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. And here are my sources. And this is my second page of sources. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching. Please like, share, comment, subscribe, do whatever you gotta do. I don't know if this is going to be on YouTube that long because of the nature of the things that I'm speaking on and the things that I write about. But if you would like to read my paper, you can scan the QR code. It is also available at the Bridgewater State University Graduate Review, Volume 10. My email is right there below. I'm going to put the paper link in the description as well. I hope you enjoyed it. I enjoyed doing this, as dark and depressing and awful as this was, to see how people do heal themselves after experiencing a traumatic event to this nature is really fascinating, and it says a lot about who we are as people and the human condition as a whole. And I just hope that you also appreciated my research, and if you have any questions, you can always shoot me an email or DM me, whatever. Thank you so much for listening to this, and go outside and do something nice for yourself, because that was very heavy. Thank you.